together. One colleague, I brought it up, and he said, "Well, I'm not racist." I'm like, this has nothing to do with it. I'm like, no, so it was like I couldn't believe it. We're going. The thing that the thought that occurred to me when he said that was, I'm like, is that where we're going? Like this is, and then he said, yeah, but it was actually, and we're talking about Chinese philosophy because our program, there's just not enough diversity. And he said something like, I read Chinese philosophy, but I have to admit that it's not as universal. And I said, well,
Oh my gosh.
come on, like,
But I have Chinese
what about
friends.
Kant's? Yeah, like about Kant, right? He wasn't racially very universal either. So I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
Right.
So it's not a conversation that's easy to have with some people. They just get
Yeah.
So when I meet somebody who says, "Here, I'm doing early modern and I'm doing curricular diversity," I'm like, "This is fantastic. That's good. Pleasure to meet you." Reza, I know. So yourself.
I'll actually introduce myself as part of the introduction. So I think we can start.
Oh,
is that okay?
yeah, absolutely. Oh, okay. You're involved with this?
Yeah.
I had no idea. Apparently met on Zoom.
Everybody, hi, Professor Rustam. So my name is Munima Moyes. I'm a graduate student at the University of Toronto Philosophy Department in my first year, and I'm interested in, well, originally in Islamic philosophy in India, but now I've shifted a bit more just to Sanskrit philosophy. So we'll see what happens. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Mohammed Rustam. Mohammed Rustam is a professor of Islamic thought and global philosophy at Carleton University, and he's a director of the Carleton Center for the Study of Islam. Professor Mohammed Rustam's work focuses on the intersection of philosophy, religion, and mysticism, as well as on cross-cultural philosophy and Quranic exegesis. He has published the award-winning book, The Triumph of Mercy, Philosophy and Scripture in Mullah Sadra. I wanted to bring my copy, but I forgot. I like to hold it up, and The Essence of Reality, A Defense of Philosophical Sufism. His forthcoming works include Global Philosophy, a source book, and In Rushes of the Heart, the Sufi philosophy of Ainul Qudat.
Thank you.
Oh,
yeah. I wanted to actually bring a copy of it too.
I thought you were going to say that. I went on the website and it said pre-order.
Yeah.
I went this morning.
No problem. I wish I had an extra copy of it.
No. I was just like, because I thought it would have come out by now. That's why. But it must be out. I don't know. The website was glitching. Professor Rustam has been the recipient of lots of academic distinctions and prizes, including Ibn Arabi's Society Latina's Tarjuman Prize, a Templeton Foundation Global Philosophy of Religion grant, the Institute of Ismaili Studies Anne-Marie Schimmel Fellowship, Iran's World Prize for the Book of the Year, which was for Triumph of Mercy, and senior fellowships courtesy of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute Library of Arabic Literature and Humanities Research Fellowship programs. So Professor Rustam's work has looked into how we can think through focusing on other traditions that aren't as mainstream in philosophy. In Triumph of Mercy, he looked at the work of Mullah Sadra, an influential 16th century Iranian philosopher mystic, and he showed how he was able to reframe his ontology about the fundamentality of being into a theological and scriptural framework. Just on a more personal level, I really like Professor Rustam's work because it's almost sort of aspirational to me. So to think how we can go through different disciplines and try to, maybe translate them and have them talk to each other, just because they're also somehow parts of ourselves, like a philosophical part maybe and a mystical part. So I'm really, really pleased that Professor Mohammed Rustam is here, and I'll turn it over to you. Sorry, I should mention, the talk is for about 50 minutes. We take a 5-minute break here at U of P, and then we have a Q&A.
Yeah, you see that's how we do it?
Yes. Yeah? We have a break.
All right, there's a break. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all so very much for coming on this rainy, cold day. And I see some friends also on Zoom, including Deborah Black. Nice to see you, Deborah, after so long.
Nice to see you too.
And I thank Lisa for the invitation. Well, I said I kind of let the cat out of the bag a little too early. I said I have a surprise for you. But I didn't fully spell out what it is. So you're gonna have to wait and see where I'm gonna go with this. Now, what I thought I should do is put forward an argument for well, I'd like to do two things. One, put forward an argument for how philosophy can be approached through different epistemic lenses. In my case, using contemporary Islamic philosophy and also the tradition of pre-modern Islamic philosophy, kind of as my starting point. And then also to demonstrate that theoretical stuff kind of in practice. So generally, when we think of philosophical traditions, we tend to reify them. So they just become like ideas, and we forget that these are real people who are alive and who had blood flowing through their veins, and who thought and who cried and who laughed and slept and ate and so on and so forth. So I'd like to try to kind of bring the human dimension of philosophy into the equation as well. That's why I appreciate what you said, Mohammed, because that really is what it comes down to. Like we are people at the end of the day, right? So this stuff has to be able to make sense to us intellectually, but also existentially. And if it doesn't, then you know, at least for me, it ceases to lose interest. That's why, like, it was my nemesis as a student philosophy. I loved philosophy so much, but then I would tend to not like it too. Actually, I have to say, Deborah Black's class, her undergraduate class that I took 20 years ago, that was one of the biggest motivations for me to really get into philosophy, because we read the theoretical stuff, but I remember also reading that Razi text, you know, the book of the philosophical life. And it was so practical and it was so interesting at the same time. So hats off to you, Deborah. In many ways, it's because of you that I'm here. By the end of the lecture, you can determine whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Right. So allow me to begin. I have the first part of my presentation is a formal paper, and then it gets a little wild. So the setting takes us to about over a decade ago. And I was delivering a lecture, and it was part of it was a philosophy colloquium in my department. And it was hosted by, you know, some very good individuals who are still there. And unlike most of, if not every other paper delivered in this colloquium series, my topic had to do with a non-European philosophical tradition, Islamic philosophy. The title of the lecture was on death and dreaming in Islamic philosophy. And this, I suspect, was the reason so many people had attended, professors and students alike. After all, we all dream and we all experience death in one way or another. So the title would quite naturally speak to diverse kinds of people. One of the main points made in the paper was that we cannot view Islamic philosophy as simply an extension of the Western philosophical tradition. We have to see it on its own terms and in conversation, not with just late antiquity, but also as representative of a philosophical tradition that addresses its own theoretical problems through its own perspectives and worldviews, and I should also add, is still very much alive today. Right? Islamic philosophy wasn't done up till the 13th century. There are living Islamic philosophical traditions across the globe, from Turkey to Iran to Malaysia to New York, you name it, everywhere in between. My task would have been made a lot easier if Peter Adamson's Philosophy in the Islamic World had been published at that time. At any rate, I simply stated the position just mentioned as I moved along in the lecture. Now, by the end of the talk, I was surprised to see how many people in the audience, including the colloquium organizers, were pleased and perhaps even relieved to hear of something so familiar yet so different. Most of the questions and comments were well thought out and incisive, but then a philosophy professor, a colleague, put up his hand and proceeded with voicing his main objection. And this is what he said. He actually got up and said, main objection. He literally said, I don't know his name, so for the longest time in the hallway, I referred to him as main objection. Main objection walking. Of course, I never told him that. So this is what he said. You said that for the Islamic philosophers, God is a so-called best of plotters. But plotting implies deceit and deception, and these can hardly be qualities of a benevolent and omniscient God. If God plots, then he schemes, and if he schemes, then this implies some kind of badness, which means he cannot be God. Now, I was flabbergasted because, well, I'll tell you why in a moment, but I offered the following response. I said to him, firstly, it is not the Muslim philosophers who say that God is the best of plotters. That phrase goes back to the Quran 2 times, 354, 830, which say that God is khairul makirin, the best of plotters. It is true that plotting implies some kind of scheming, but what's wrong with that? In the Quran, God's scheming is juxtaposed with human scheming, which is, of course, fraught with folly. I then presented a proposal and an example, both of which most people can understand and perhaps even with which they can identify. The proposition was that plotting can be motivated by love and a fundamental care for people. The example here it is. In order for me to make it on time for that lecture that I was giving, I literally had to come up with a plot with my wife of how we would divert our 1-year-old son's attention to another part of the house in order for me to make my escape. Reza knows what I'm talking about. Simply making an attempt to walk out of the house was not an option since it would sadden the child, which would mean I would have to console him, which would mean I would likely be late for the lecture. Or worse, I would have to drive faster than usual to get to the lecture and put myself and others in danger on the road. I continued, so you can see, sir, how plotting need not always be evil and bad, even on the human scale. This applies a fortiori on the divine scale. Now, my interlocutor was silenced. A whole other way of thinking about God had been presented to him through the example of human plotting, and one which I hope would have challenged the very categories with which he would henceforth approach issues in the so-called discipline of the philosophy of religion. I can say after 13 years that the man hasn't changed at all. He's the exact same. In fact, he's gotten worse over the years. Then I concluded, allow me to zero in on your question. Saying that God plots or schemes may be troublesome for a certain kind of thinker whose focus is traditional Western philosophy of religion, which has always been dictated by Christian and largely Eurocentric problem sets and categories. If we look outside of that perspective, we will see that apart from one particular worldview, other philosophical worldviews like the Islamic have their own ways of conceiving of their indigenous problems. And if God's plotting means something in that worldview, which it certainly does, then let it stand on its own and let us hear what Muslims have to say about it. We can then evaluate the position's coherence, value, and the like. Had another book been published at that time, namely Timothy Knepper's The Ends of Philosophy of Religion, I would certainly have drawn my questioner's attention to it. In this work, Knepper argues that the discipline of the philosophy of religion has to move far beyond the traditional confines and issues that have animated this tradition in the modern Western academy. It is a much more global phenomenon, he says, and this because other major philosophical and religious traditions have also been concerned with what we have called and can call the philosophy of religion. It is just that the problems posed by these other traditions' worldviews have often been quite different from, but no less important than, the fundamental philosophical and religious problems identified by Christianity. Indeed, viewing philosophy of religion through a global perspective, we can at minimum help enliven and reshape the narrow and ill-defined but still dominant field of philosophy of religion. One issue that can fall within the purview of philosophy of religion on the one hand and the domain of theology on the other is that of the silence of God. This can refer to God's being silent today as juxtaposed to his having spoken at some point in the past. Framed in context, this has to do with the manner in which God spoke to Jews and Christians in the past, but does not appear to do so anymore, at least not through the medium of revelation. Related to the Judeo-Christian problem of God no longer communicating to human beings is the more universal fact of God's perceived silence in the face of human suffering. For many today, this does not mean that God is somehow unaware of or oblivious to the plight of humans. Rather, in spite of his omniscience and benevolence, God seems to allow certain kinds of wrongs to happen to people. Making sense of why this is the case and what this can mean in the long run all pertain to reflections on what can perhaps be referred to as silence of God theology. One may argue that silence of God theology is marked by a fundamental humility, since believers can accept the fact of human suffering and the very real possibility that God is not doing something about this suffering right now, but that there is a profound wisdom behind this divine silence, which will be made known at some point in the future, if not in the afterlife. Some who delve into this question are certainly led to opposing conclusions. God is more like a clockmaker, as posited by deism, rather than being a real actor in and through human affairs. Or, since there is no God, speaking of the silence of God is tantamount to saying that if there were a God, there would not be human suffering, especially on such grandiose scales as we have seen over the past century. Taking Knepper's insights on the importance of conceiving of the philosophy of religion through a global lens, what kind of problem, if at all, is the so-called silence of God in Islamic philosophy? As William Chittick puts it, if the Islamic metaphysicians of the past were presented with this idea, their response would likely be, and I'm quoting him, "Try listening for once." Typical his sense of humor. After all, one of God's fundamental attributes in Islamic thought is that of speech, kalam. God is thus the speaking, which is taken to mean that God speaks eternally, without ceasing speech at any point. This is the cue for the communication thing, by the way. The great thinkers of the Islamic tradition have delved deeply into what this divine speech entails and how it relates to God's self-reflexivity and to the created order. I will not attempt to engage these points here, since they will take me too far afield. What is essential to keep in mind is that in Islamic philosophy, God's being a speaking agent entails a cosmic picture in which all things are not only addressees of divine speech, but are themselves acts and embodiments of this speech. That is to say that God's speech in Islamic metaphysics has a self-reflexive aspect, and it also has a generative or ontologically productive aspect. For the Muslim sages in particular, all things in the cosmic order form so many individual parts of God's speech. They each arise within the divine creative breath, nafas, which brought the cosmos into existence. Or framed differently, we can say that each thing in the cosmos constitutes a reverberation of the divine command, which itself brought the cosmos into being. Thus, human beings are themselves living proof that God is always speaking, since they exist as so many words which collectively account for one aspect of God's speech. God is therefore never silent cosmologically speaking, nor is he silent anthropologically speaking. But what about the actual problem of God's seeming silence in the face of human suffering? In order to do justice to this problem, some comments are in order concerning the existence of evil. The attempt to reconcile divine goodness with the existence of evil in the world, of course, is known as the problem of theodicy. It's a term that ultimately goes back to Leibniz. Well before him, however, the basic issue fundamental to theodicy was dealt with in many different civilizations and in a variety of ways. In Islamic philosophy, one of the greatest and earliest attempts at presenting a robust defense of divine goodness in the face of evil is to be found in the writings of Avicenna, which had a long life in the Islamic intellectual tradition. The basic features of his defense of the divine goodness take us to the question of the presence of evil in the world. By evil is meant anything that is bad and which displays an absence to some degree of what is good. The answer to the question, does evil exist, is given in the affirmative. It is clear that all kinds of evil exist in the cosmos, both on grandiose and minuscule scales. Avicenna distinguishes between accidental and essential evils in the metaphysics section of his book of healing, Kitab al-Shifa. Accidental evils arise as a natural consequence of the created order. That is to say that bad things occur in the world by virtue of the world being what it is. On an elemental level, this means things like fire, which contain much benefit for people by virtue of its intrinsic properties, can and does exercise much harm. Fire can thus warm a house, but it can also burn a person. If fire could not warm a home, it would also not burn that person. But by force of nature, it will necessarily do both. Essential evils are rather different. They amount to a thing's not being realized in a particular substrate, which by nature ought to have that thing in question realized in it. Avicenna gives us the well-known case of blindness. It is an instance of essential evil because it entails the lack or privation of sight in a receptacle, that is the ocular faculty, which itself exists in order for the end of sight to be realized within it. Now, evils are therefore an inherent feature of our universe. Asking why evil exists if God is all good is tantamount to asking why the world exists if God is all good. Given what the world and the order of nature are, there will naturally be all kinds of disparities, variations, and even evils amongst the things in them. And this, of course, is to say nothing about human freedom, which itself is the cause of much evil in the world. To seek a world where such features are not present is to ask for another kind of world than the present one. And if we could do that, then the very question of theodicy, which likely only has meaning in our current cosmic configuration, would be meaningless. Having thus come away with a basic picture of how the Islamic philosophical tradition thinks about the presence of evils in the world, I can now turn my attention to how it deals with them, practically speaking. Since it has already been established that from an Islamic metaphysical perspective, God is never silent, and that evils are a real and necessary feature of the cosmic order, what can be said about human suffering and the divine response to it? In other words, when humans suffer, especially in the worst of possible ways, where is God's voice amidst all of it? Part of the problem, as I see it, with speaking of the so-called silence of God, is that it assumes that the presence and even persistence of human suffering require God to respond in a certain way, and perhaps even at a certain time. This is quite a natural human tendency and is evinced by both the Bible, think of Job 30:20, for example, and the Quran, 2:14, for example. But in a person's weakest and darkest moments, does God really abandon him, or is something else at work? Does he not always respond even if we do not hear him? One can do no better here than call to mind the beloved 20th century poem Footprints. During our most downtrodden and awful times, the poem teaches us, we drag ourselves along thinking that we are alone in suffering our plight, only to realize that it was God who was carrying us all the while. This also calls to mind a story, one of my favorite, from Rumi's Masnavi. He tells a tale of a man who calls out to God in earnest all night and day in prayer. But the man hears no divine response, and it is then that the devil comes upon the scene and tries to convince the dejected person that there is no God to hear him, and that he should thus give up hope in the divine altogether. At this point, the broken-hearted servant falls asleep and has a dream in which he comes to learn that God had in fact been answering his call all along. So here's the poem in English. The fear and love, this is God talking to the servant in his dream, the fear and love you express are what tie you to my bounty. Under every, "Oh Lord," that you uttered, there were many labaiks coming from me. Tarso ishketo kamanda lutfemost, zira har ya rabbeto, labaik host. Labaik, or "here I am," is the well-known phrase that Muslims utter during the rites of the pilgrimage to Makkah. For Rumi, it is not man who says, "Here I am." Rather, it is God who says it to man, and this not only in some circumstances, but always and forever. In other words, God's presence and aid are always there, however imperceptible they may be to our limited human understanding and experience of the world. On a more subtle level, Rumi is also driving home the point that our very calling out to God is itself the divine response to our prayers. For the Muslim metaphysicians, being able to hear God's call, "Here I am," goes back to the fundamental importance of cultivating the right kind of hearing. How can this be done? The answer lies in human silence. By bringing the soul to rest and eliminating what the Muslim doctors of the heart call internal chatter, or hadithun nafs, our souls become more prone to attentively hearing God's voice within ourselves. In our world, filled as it is with all kinds of cacophonic sounds and alarming images, cultivating this kind of inwardness is difficult indeed. But the more engrossed we remain in these sounds and images, the less will we be able to hear God's voice and see these signs of his. Teaching ourselves to be silent not only takes away the internal noises within, but it can also drown out the noises without, one of which are our own voices. That's not to say that one should be silent in the world or in the face of oppression and the like. Rather, the silence in question is an attitude of the soul. It is something of a fundamental spiritual orientation in the world that allows man's own voice to recede to the background. By becoming silent in this way, man therefore ceases to be deaf to God's eternal addition. Hearing God's voice in the face of terrible suffering will certainly not help explain the suffering away or somehow relativize or trivialize it. By the same token, cultivating the ability to hear God's voice is not preconditioned on man's being able to figure out the why and the how of suffering. What is certain is that for those not spiritually tone deaf to God's speech, the very sound of the divine voice amidst all of the pain in the world can serve as a soothing balm for the soul, healing even the deepest of wounds. Now, all that I have said thus far is rather theoretical, as I alluded to, the surprise is coming. Allow me to shift gears here and examine the practical dimensions of the art of listening by presenting a dialogue between a philosophy graduate student and a certain sage whom the student mysteriously chances upon one morning on his way to class. The student poses several challenging questions to the sage on the nature of evil and suffering, and the sage responds point by point, leaving the questioner with much to think about concerning his own epistemic resources and categories of interpretation. So I'm going to present a dialogue for you now. And so now I had originally thought that a good idea would be to have somebody read the lines of the student and then I read the lines of the sage. But for certain rhetorical reasons, I think it's better that I just do both. And I'm going to try to differentiate between them by the student sounding kind of like a student does, you know. Not so. I don't really know what that means, but right? Just the studenty, you know, and the sage, sagey, right? So the sage will noticeably talk slower. That's how you'll know it's the sage. Right? He's not measuring out his words, right? Okay, good. So I'm glad you guys like that. So now, and I'm gonna have some action sequences too between the dialogue just to keep it kind of alive and give you an idea of where things go. So it begins like this. Plagued by the problem of evil, a student of philosophy and religion finds himself in great despair with many more annoying questions than satisfying answers. Because that's typical, right? The student passes by a certain hakim or sage as he takes his usual route to his early morning philosophy of religion seminar. Drawn towards the sage's luminous presence, the student attempts to approach the old man. So it begins with a student. Salam alaikum. Alaikum salam. Sir, are you new to the neighborhood? No, no. I have been walking through this pathway every morning at 8 a.m. for the past 20 years, and I normally take refuge on that bench over there, which I call the Ark of Noah. That's weird. I've been walking by here almost every morning at 8 a.m. also, at least for the past several years. How is it that I have never seen you? Well, I have always been here and have always seen you pass by. And you never said salam? It would have been of no use. Can I ask why? Because you were not ready to see me. Please explain. The sage looks up to the sun, then turns his gaze over to the student. Does a blind man see the sun? No, 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 of course not. Even if it is actually there? Yes, naturally. But if the blind man could all of a sudden see, would he then see the sun? Yes. So too is it the case with you. You were blind before, but now you can see, which is why we are looking to one another. So can I now see because I'm ready? Yes. Ready for what exactly, dear sir? I still do not understand. One of my brothers once said, the arrival of divine aid accords with readiness. So I am now ready to receive God's help, as ready as you can be at this current point along the curve of your life. I like the way you speak, sir, and I see that you have some special kind of knowledge to share with me. I tend to think of it as the lack of a common kind of ignorance. Sure, whatever. I mean, you clearly know things that I don't, and I bet you know much more than most people. That is because people are asleep, and asuniyam. The one who is not asleep is awake, and thus is more aware than those who are asleep. I see. So what you have is an awareness, a wakefulness. It's a lack of sleep, and sleep corresponds to ignorance. Whatever I have been given has been given to me as a gift from his presence. Allusion to Iqbal. Sorry, but what did you do to gain this knowledge? The sage shakes his head from left to right as he knocks at an invisible door. All that one could ever do is knock with sincerity, fervor, and persistence. As the master of the first and the last said, if you keep knocking at the door, it is likely to be opened. So sincerity is the key? Yes, sincerity is like a key that can open the door to this knowledge. Fervor and persistence are like the act of opening that door. I must at least be a little ready for this knowledge that you have, right? I mean, you said I'm ready for divine aid. Your sincerity is there, but you lack something that will impede you from further progress. What is that? Sorry for asking. Aspiration. But I do have aspiration. I often read all night and day, studying, reading, reflecting. In fact, I'm currently writing an essay, which I hope to publish in an important on the concept of grit in philosophy. Right? That's, what more do I need to say about aspiration? I'm writing on grit, for God's sake. You indeed do have aspiration, but the arrow of your aspiration is set toward the wrong target. So you always miss the mark. Now, how do you know that? Because it is a common phenomenon. I see it in many students of philosophy and religion. They have intelligence and sincerity of purpose for the most part, and they have a lot of desire and aspiration, but for the wrong thing. So what is the right thing towards which I should aspire? First, you must tell me what it is that you want. I want to know God, I guess, and the ways of God. Well, if you sincerely seek to know God, you should aspire towards that. But I thought I do. You do in theory, but in practice, it is something else. How can one practice to know God? As a Muslim, other than pray the daily prayers, perform the litanies, read the Quran, follow the Blessed Prophet, and all that. That is how one should practice to come to know God if he is Muslim. But it is more about the level of intensity of these actions. Have you not heard the noble verse from the Quran? Those who believe are more intense in their love for God. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبًّا لِلَّهِ. Those who believe are more intense in their love for God. Intensity in action. So if I'm more intense in my practices, I will come to know God, who is the object of my aspiration? Perhaps. But if I just focus on action, will not my intelligence diminish? That is what many people think. If a person devotes himself to action, he becomes more intelligent, not less intelligent. I see. Conversely, if one devotes himself just to cultivating his intelligence without the corresponding action, he will be less intelligent. Strange, I know some pretty smart guys who only write and think. They cultivate what is known as partial intelligence. But the real intelligence of which I speak is more like intelligence with a capital I, that is intelligence. With a puzzled look on his face, the student throws his hands to the sky. You distinguish between kinds of intelligence? I do. Partial intelligence is good for all kinds of rational operations, and much of our world runs on it. But it is partial, which means it cannot see the big picture. And the intelligence with a capital I, it is like a light that shines from up above and illuminates the entirety of a dark room. Partial intelligence can only shed light on particular corners of that room, leaving many objects in it in obscurity. But why do people focus on partial intelligence instead of this capital I intelligence that you're speaking of? The answer is simple. It is, as Rumi says, it's a poem from Rumi, the partial intellect has given the capital I intellect a bad name. Desire for the world has made people desire less for God. Astounding. I think I understand what you are saying. I see a lot of intellectual know-how and mental acrobatics in my fields of study, and I'm sad to say I often see them in myself. Of course, it is natural. The more a person focuses on his partial intelligence and seeks to cultivate it and make it the arbiter of all things, the more will his aspirations suffer. What then happens? What normally happens is that he will aspire for the wrong things. He will, for example, continue to seek God, but not on God's own terms. Rather, it will be on his own terms, in accordance with his partial intelligence and what it shows to him to be real, important, and meaningful. Can you explain further? One time a friend of God was asked what religion he follows. He replied, I follow the religion of my Lord. Ana ala madhabi Rabbi, famous lines of Hallaj. Interesting, student says. Everyone turns towards this direction or that direction, but the sincere ones have turned towards the direction of no direction. Is this what they call the station of no station? Maqam la maqam. Yes, those who have gone to God and subsist in him never return to any station, and are thus not bound by anything, much less the partial intellect. That must be a lovely place to be. I mean, one would never be bogged down by any kind of philosophical problem, for example. The sage folds his arms, smiles, and then looks off into the distance. Philosophical and theological problems are problems insofar as they are seen from the perspective of the human. But from the perspective of the divine, there are no problems as such. I wish they incorporated this vantage point into my philosophy and religion courses. This is where you come in, right? That would be a great benefit to human beings. As the fourth teacher says, there is nothing more timely than the timeless. You know, sir, there is a problem I've been having, a philosophical one, concerning what is known in philosophy of religion as a problem of evil. It would be interesting to see what you have to say about it. With his hand on his heart, the sage nods his head. At your service. Thank you. It has kept me up for many nights. I can see very well what you mean about the partial intelligence. It seems that almost every approach to the problem I have seen has been from this perspective. The answers are never fully satisfactory. How can they be fully satisfactory when they are partial answers? Insofar as a person operates at the level of the partial intelligence, he will be unable to truly address the problem of evil. Only the sages can really answer this question. Indeed, those going to God flee from evil, but those coming from God move towards it. Oh, what do these words mean? What does that mean? This world we are in right now is in the realm of evil, and so it is where evil is a problem. There are those who flee from the world and go towards God, with whom there is no evil. There are those who are with God and who come back to the world of evil in order to help those stuck in it. Then there are those who are mired in this world of evil. With their feet firmly planted in the soil of the realm of evil, they try to resolve the problem of evil. But a person mired in evil will never solve the problem of evil. It seems to me that you have already taken me in directions where I never thought this question can or perhaps even should go. But explain why this problem of evil is not a problem for you. Is it because you are not of this world anymore? The sage looks down for what seems like an eternity. And then he looks directly at the student with eyes resembling a vast ocean at dawn. My place is the placeless, my trace the traceless, and my name the nameless. Going and coming are equal to me, and time and change do not define me. So you are beyond the category of evil? I would rather say that the sage sees no darkness and evil, for he beholds all things through the light of God. That is wondrous, and I wish I could someday see things the way you do. But you must surely acknowledge that evil is a real and life feature of the world that we live in. And I don't just mean lesser evils, but also horrendous evils, and what would seem like gratuitous evils. Yes, of course, to deny the existence of evil on its own level is to deny the existence of the world on its own level. And on its own level, the world is real. But then why is there evil in this real world of ours? It is because of the infinity of God, or what some call his all possibility. God's all possibility entails self-negation, which entails manifestation, which entails separation, which entails evil. Oh, I know this argument well. God is all good, and where he is not, there is evil. Since he is not in the world, evil is in the world. Not quite. Soon dejected. God is indeed in the world, but not by way of essential identification. Thus, the cosmos is not to be identified with God essentially. I once heard it said that God is not in the world per se, but rather the world is mysteriously plunged in him. I don't quite get your point. Sorry. You say sorry too much. Exactly. Exactly. Right. You say sorry too much. Be real in everything you say and do. Sorry. I mean, thank you. No, say what is in your heart. Never move around in the clothing of artificial formalities, quoting an Indian sage. Sorry. I mean, okay, fine. I don't know what you mean. Much better. God is not absent from the world. There is no place wherein God is absent. If that were so, then that place would not be a place. Every place is a place because of the presence of God within it. But there are varying degrees of presence, from the most intense, the presence of God himself, to other levels of intensity ranging from scripture to the heart of a perfected human being, and then lesser levels of intensity ranging from the cosmos to our world. But didn't the proof of Islam, Al-Ghazali, the proof of Islam, say that our world is the best of possible worlds? Ours is the best of possible worlds, but it is also the lowest of worlds. So you mean to say that God is present in the world, but not to the same degree that he is present in higher worlds? Precisely. And it is to the degree that he is not present in this world that there is evil, which is a privation of good, as you have learned in your philosophy of religion classes. Yes, privation of good. Now, that privation of good comes out of the infinite possibilities that belong to God, hence his infinity. Delimitation is one aspect of God's infinity and perfection, which is why there is evil, since there are levels of delimitation vis-a-vis God's own perfection. And these levels are what constitute the cosmic order as we know it. I understand now. Thank you. Can I pick your brain with one more question? I hope you do not try to pick my brain. That would be painful. You mean, may I further learn from you? Yes, that really is what I meant. This strange expression, pick your brain, presumes that knowledge is in the brain, thereby reducing the human act of knowing to a purely physical, even mechanical process. But the kind of knowledge we are after is something quite different. Well, where is this knowledge that you have? It is not in the brain, that is for certain. At the same time, it has a deep cognitive dimension, that too is certain. Yet it is also supra-rational, depending on where a person is on the continuum along the upward scale of existence, this knowledge will be more or less deep. But the least of this kind of knowledge already corresponds to a stage beyond the intellect, as that great martyr of Hamadan has explained so well. That's Amin Fazan, right? Would we call this special knowing faculty the heart? Indeed, it is the heart, which is the seat of human consciousness and is in fact a manifestation of God, who is pure consciousness. So the less heart we have, the less awareness we have, and the less we perceive with the heart, the less will we be able to understand the problem of evil? Yes. This really is helpful. You know, dear sir, I took a course once on the silence of God. It drove me nuts. I always wondered how God could actually be silent. Of course, it's a much deeper problem than that, but it never quite sat well with me. How could it? God is never silent since he is the speaking, but we do not hear him since we are never silent. It's amazing how you're able to make such complicated ideas seem so simple. It is amazing how you are able to make such simple ideas seem so complicated. The student laughs out loudly with a smile from ear to ear. And you have a sense of humor. It really is a pleasure to meet you. Can I ask another question? Yes. Why would the world simply not have evil in it? Because it would then not be the world. Huh? To ask for a world without evil is to ask for another kind of world. But to ask for another kind of world is to ask for another kind of cosmic configuration, which would exclude the presence of freedom, since freedom is unique to our current cosmic configuration. I get it. Human freedom is the cause of much evil, but what about accidental evils? Why are they present in our world? Because they are in the nature of things. After all, fire burns by virtue of the same property that it warms. Of course, and there is no pure evil in the world, right? Yes, nothing in the cosmos is pure evil, for pure evil is absolute non-existence, just as pure goodness is absolute existence. The student nods his head in approval and lets out a sigh of grief. Ah, I have to go to my class now. Will I see you again? I do not know. God willing, we will meet again. You do not know if you will come here tomorrow or if I will come here, because I can be here anytime you like. I do not dwell in the past, nor do I look to the future. I live in the now. The present moment and death are the only guarantees we have. And don't forget income taxes. Both men look at each other and laugh audibly. Well, I hope for the sake of my poor soul that I can see you again. Please give me some parting advice. Pull back the veil of evil in order to truly live. I'll read that again to you. Pull back the veil of evil in order to truly live. Where did my last page go? That's strange. Okay, I don't know where it went, but allow me just to, I'll do the explaining for you. So, if you look at the word evil, right, it's EVIL. If you spell it the other way, it's live. But if you transpose two of the letters, you get the word veil. So the word evil, in its very linguistic substance of the term, it has a veil, namely the fact that it contains the word veil in it, and that if you were to remove that veil and see it backwards, it would spell live. So the dialogue ends basically they're walking out to an arch that's leading to the student's class, and as the sage gives this explanation to the student, he starts saying to himself, student, he's trying to learn, so he says, in order to truly live, in order to truly live. And as he looks up, the sage is gone. And there's a beautiful smell that's there, which is characteristic of the presence of the sages. And then the student just walks away and goes to his class and completely transformed, of course, by that experience. So that's pretty much my little surprise for all of you. I hope that you found that entertaining and then useful and edifying intellectually. Yeah, I guess we can.
Thank you so much. So it's like what, dinner and drinks or whatever, dinner and a movie. So we'll take a 5-minute break. It's 11:53, so we'll come back 11:58.
Yes.
Very good.
Would you like more water?
Yes, please.
Would you like tea? I can make green tea.
No, if I more water will be good. Thanks.
I'll pass that.
Okay, Dave here has a suggestion for the last page, so I'll put it in the main screen so that we can read it.
Yes.
Oh, okay. It's readable.
Yes.
No, I think it's his suggestion of the.
Yeah, that is the last page.
Yes, it's so nice.
Thank you very much. Well, this dialogue it came out earlier, like I think in June of this year.
Okay.
So we probably found it on.
I see.
That's yeah, and then share that with the others because that's more or less how it ends.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
And it has the explanation too of the transposition.
By everyone else.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what happened in that page. That's pretty awesome. That's never happened to me before. The page literally disappeared. I have no idea what happened to it.
It's even better. It's fresher.
I think so too. Yeah, it could very well be that when I pulled out my lecture from my thing, it just disappeared.
Yeah.
That's pretty. I'll blame one of my kids. I think one of them must have done something with it.
Yeah.
You see why Plato wrote dialogues? It's much more fun actually to use philosophy in dialogue form. It makes total sense. Actually, it's much more refreshing, than writing a prose.
So it leaves people who are locked in the partial intelligence.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Like, but can we have it in a more systematic way?
Yeah, I have sometimes I have students, they're gifted poets. They're naturally very good poets, but they're not very good essay writers. I had this one student 1 year, it's a course on contemplative traditions, and she couldn't write an essay for her life. She just her mind just didn't work that way, but she was a genuine artist and very good at it. So I said, for your final paper, I let her write a poem. I kind of addressed the question, but in the way that she was able to, with a little bit of an explanation, because I had to make sure she understood what she was talking about. And the explanation part wasn't that good, but the poem itself was incredible. It was so good. And I thought to myself, hey, you know what? I think part of this curricular diversity thing is to accommodate different skills.
Student a few days back, she was telling me how much she hates it that many of the assignments are now creative, and she really would like to just say things instead of being forced to look at it from the perspective of write a lecture or a diary entry.
Because there are different kinds of learners. Some people don't like that, right? And one time I had my students on the short story or something like that. And I had some of the students, there were some engineering and philosophy, some of them were like, oh, no, we don't want to write short stories. Let me write a normal essay. So that's our trade at the end of the day. It's essays and books and stuff. But if we can do something different, then it might make it more interesting for the students, especially. Like there was a reason why as a student I like Plato and I like Nietzsche. Those two, it's the Western. It was expensive, yes. So creative, so
I think there's also so much one feels a person and the rest like
exactly. It's the form of literature. And so we're dealing with Islamic philosophers. A lot of them wrote stories, a lot of them wrote short stories, symbolic tales, poems.
I have an outline.
Poetry is
Professor
really
is very nice.
nice.
So my issue like write outlines.
That's what I
I knew what the outline was, I would have written. Yes. But it's been very extended. So I really need to.
Maybe Nina was telling me you might work on somebody with a situation was being in sense.
Yeah. So I don't know.
I think
all that's right, but yeah, I want to find out very far out. And that's hard to live so far from your workplace.
But I think from like a kind of watching nice, then you get to I'm really not certain. That's what I was saying. And I might just go down the
Where do you live, John?
So I live by a dogland state, like town, but actually moving.
That feels like interesting.
My landlady lives next door. She built two skinny houses on the same block.
I see.
You know, like
some landladies,
I have to know the language.
She's a nice, but she's renting out this house for years.
But I mean, partly is that parts in her I wonder if you're interested in sensory
for having guests.
So,
but I agree with others.
Generally, very insular, and other thinkers were also quite insular, and they did learn each other.
So the mention you did is for, but I'm actually saving. I'm not paying for rent.
I think we can resume. Sorry, everyone, for making it less fun. Questions now, and as usual, that's another one of the nice UFP rules, and you were sort of surprised by the 5 minutes. So I wonder whether they have always been there or whether they're in the region.
I don't remember, but I remember it being. I don't remember getting. I don't know the colloquia. Last time I was at one of the colloquia was in medieval philosophy colloquia. That was different. There were like 5 or 6 people or something. I don't remember what it was like, but it's the 5 minutes was nice, and I got new water. So
anyway, one of the nice rules I learned by moving here is students first. Please.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously I really enjoyed the talk, so thank you so much. I was wondering about the higher worlds that you mentioned in one of the sages' replies. And this was, I think it was something like, we're in the lowest worlds. And I was just wondering, like, if maybe to follow up on behalf of the grad student character, what do we ever experience any of those higher worlds? Like, is there a human place in there? If not, do we experience it as something else maybe after we die or something like this? So I was just wondering if you could say more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. In one of my courses that I teach, I normally, when we get to this part of the discussions in Sufi metaphysics, Islamic philosophy, I normally have them watch Inception.
Nice.
We deal with and then there's a friend of mine, Olud Amino Gunaiki, he has an amazing article where he looks at Ibn Arabi and Inception, levels of consciousness and interpenetration of these different worlds. So the long and the short of it is, if you watch Inception, you get some idea of kind of what's going on. But there is an etymological problem with the word world that's kind of implied in the Arabic but is lost in translation. What we call world in English, in Arabic there are two terms, at least two terms that are like standard, and they both mean world but in different senses. So the first word is the word alam, alam with an ain, and that comes from a word that has to do with being a marker, like a flag is an alama, for example, right? A very learned person is an alama, or alama, like alama tabai, for example, right? Somebody who kind of has they can point to other things, and they themselves are like, a reference point kind of thing. But the other word is dunya, which is the standard Arabic term for just this worldly life. It can also be like the name of a female in Arabic, right? And that word dunya comes from a root in Arabic that has to do with something that's low. So the standard Arabic term, which is then found in every Islamic language you can think of, that refers to this world here, this Earth and everything that it contains, everything under the sublunar realm, right? That's the dunya. That's the lowest of all physical points of manifestation of any entity you can think of. It's all going to happen here in this lower space. So insofar as humans are trapped in that lower sphere, and insofar as their bodies, they can't experience some of those higher worlds, and there's many of them. But they luckily, according to these authors, don't just have bodies, right? They have other cognitive faculties within them. They have a heart. They have what you would call a mind, even though there's no really good Arabic term for that. They have a soul or spirits. They have certain other modes of perception and intelligence, and in this capital I, intelligence. And so with those faculties, they can access these other higher realms of being, even while trapped down here. That's why they call this place the cosmic crypt, right? It's like a prison, right? You're stuck in prison, but your soul is not, your mind is not. And the greatest window into that, they say that everybody experiences this on one level or another. The greatest experience into it is in our dreams. You dream, you'll notice that one of the features of dreams is that they can often have disembodied states, right? So you can like say to your friend, "Oh, I saw you in a dream last night," and then they'd be like, "Well, what was I wearing?" And you're like, "No, it wasn't. You weren't. It wasn't like physically you, but it was just like you. It was the meaning of you. I just knew it was you." So we can kind of like abstract, forms from meanings, and dreams are like a wonderful place for that. And that's kind of like a window into all of this. But at higher levels, for sure, like someone like that sage, for example, right? Remember, he says he's not placeless, he's not traceless, right? He's out of names. All those physical frames of reference are gone because he's no longer in any place of change, right? His body is physically, which is why it decays and dies and everything like that happens. But then in the other, world, which is where he stands, which is more subsistent and persistent, it is the place in which he's actualized that capital I intellect. So you can actualize that at every cosmic level, right? Yeah.
So I thank you so much, first of all. It was really enjoyable, and I like that approach of like a dialogue. Um, I guess I'm wondering, so the sage, the way you portrayed him, I guess I wonder, so you know how Muhammad Iqbal is that like Indian Pakistan, he was in Pakistan before, but anyway, the Indian thinker and the
Don't
20th
say that in
century.
Pakistan. You're allowed to, it's not a non-grata for your whole life if you say that in Pakistan.
Subcontinental thinker, South Asian thinker of the early 20th century before Pakistan was made. That's if people don't know what we're talking about. Yeah, so he has like a criticism of Sufism of his time, and his criticism is that like your sages and your saints, they're just like really resigned. They're always in like some other world. They're detached. We need people like men of action, right?
Yeah.
Like he has a big thing about a real Sufi is someone who's like creating, like there's a self-creation, and he's very active, and it's like he seizes, it's almost like the Nietzschean Übermensch, but like it's an Islamic tone. So I just wonder, do you think that like this conception of evil like kind of promotes detachment from the world because it's like the stuff that doesn't exist? Yeah.
Yeah. So Iqbal, you know, he was extremely complicated as a human being, right? And part of his criticism of Sufism and some of Islamic philosophy too, it came out of his lack of understanding of those traditions. See, it's really strange because he was a great Urdu poet, and he's the only non-Persian who I know who's actually considered a Persian poet by the Persians. Iqbal al-Lahuri, for example, you must have read him in high school. But I don't know of any non-Persian. Like I have a childhood friend of mine who till today doesn't think I know Persian. You know, he says to me, "This is not Persian. We're just being right," because he can't hear the outside of my South Asian accent. But with Iqbal, he was genuinely considered like this master of Persian literature, Urdu. When it came to the Islamic intellectual tradition, his knowledge was extremely limited, and it was largely funneled through the reception of certain British understandings of the Islamic intellectual tradition. So Iqbal was a very good student of, he knew Western philosophy not very well, but he knew enough of it to kind of use it for his own kind of project. But his understanding of the Islamic tradition was much more limited, and so with that came this kind of British scorn for Sufism as kind of being otherworldly and also not Islamic, because these Muslims are supposed to be dry Semitic peoples. What are they doing loving God and all of these kinds of things? That was part of it. So there was a certain kind of Orientalism that was part and parcel of Iqbal's worldview. And the other part of it was that he simply just wasn't aware of Islamic philosophy. It's actually remarkable. I too would not be allowed in Pakistan if I ever said this, but it's a fact that Iqbal hadn't read Islamic philosophy. And his Arabic, he didn't know Arabic well enough to really engage the sources. Muhammad Farooq, a colleague of mine, has an article called "Iqbal in the Islamic Philosophical Tradition." He's actually in Pakistan right now. I'm sure people don't know about that article because he's Bengali actually. But in it, he actually goes through the whole curriculum of Iqbal's education and what it was. Basically, it was very heavy on literature, a little bit of Islamic, the Quran and things like this. And then he jumps into McTaggart and Nietzsche and Burke's. This is his. So that criticism that Sufism is otherworldly and world denying and that kind of stuff, it comes out of a certain place in India, and it was kind of marshaled as the evidence for why Islam had fallen backwards, especially in post-colonial Indian context. But it was informed by the British criticism generally of Islamic mystical practices. And then it comes from another tradition as well, which is from Ahmed Sirhindi onwards. So in the 1700s, about 250 years before Iqbal took up the pen, there were certain authors who were against what they call the wujudi excesses, right? Ahmed Sirhindi is the best example. And so instead of wahdat al-wujud, or the oneness of being, he put forward an idea called wahdat al-shuhud. And it's very likely, if you read Sirhindi's writings, that he didn't himself know Ibn Arabi or any of these authors in the tradition, because Ibn Arabi, for as much as he's emphasizing the oneness of being, he spends much more time talking about the otherness of things, kathratul ilm, the manyness of knowledge. And Waqt al-Shuhud is like it's like the opposite. It's like the two sides of the same coin with Waqt al-Wujud. So Iqbal kind of took in also a little bit of that Indian criticism of this Sufism as this otherworldly denying phenomena, and it matched up very well with modernist discourses that you find in Egypt as well. The common criticism amongst Muslim modernists, who were all influenced by colonialism, one level or another, intellectually and culturally, was that Sufism is the one that we have to blame. It's kind of like the scapegoat for why Muslims are so backwards today. But if you look at the evidence on the ground, it's very different, right? Some of the greatest freedom fighters during that exact same time period, like Amir Abdul Qadir Jazairi, for example, Sheikh Shamal Dageshtani, Uthman Dan Fodio, they were all major practicing Sufis who were they fought in war, they were defending their lands, sometimes against Muslims when they were wronging Christians when it wasn't correct, like in the case of Abdul Qadir Jazairi. So that criticism doesn't really hold together. If you look at the evidence on the ground, that was contemporaneous with Iqbal's own time. It works very well in poetry when you need to blame somebody, right? But there's a fourth aspect to this too, which is part of the general ambience of Islamic literature, which is that a Sufi, it can mean somebody who's, a practicing, realized mystic along the way. And often the Muslim philosophers and Sufis, they were kind of engaged in the same trade. But there is a sense in Persian and Arabic literature in which a Sufi can also refer to kind of a lazy person. It's in Rumi's Masnavi like that, for example, right? Like, and it's like, what is this person doing? Oh, he's just a Sufi. He's just lying around doing nothing all day. Later on, maybe smoking some taryag or something like this. So, Shamsa Tabrizi, Rumi's famous beloved companion, said, if you were to ask, should I keep the company of the Sufis, and he himself is a major Sufi, or the company of the jurists, I would rather hang out with the jurists, not the Sufis, because at least they're doing something. They're learning, So there is that kind of slight criticism as well, which is that they're kind of like they're just basically deadbeats, for lack of a better term. But Iqbal, it's his own view. It's much more nuanced, as I try to put forth for you. And the fifth part of it has to do with the fact that when he puts forward this idea of this Khudi, in his book Asrar al-Khudi, he's trying very, very hard to match the Insane Kamil, or the perfect, complete human being, with Nietzsche's Übermensch. And whenever there was kind of, resemblance between those two perspectives, it became an authentic representation of what for him was Sufism. This person who forges his own way, who's no longer bound to any, mores and values. But the Übermensch and the Insane Kamil are two totally different concepts. It's like people who compare Heidegger's Dasein with Mullah Sadra's perspective on Wujud. There's books about this, and they're hilarious because they're talking about two totally different things. So Iqbal had kind of like a modernist project, and he had a reason for why he needed to do that. But it goes part and parcel with the modernist criticism of kind of, the intellectualism of Sufis. Many authors in his own day and age were living ulama as well, who had the same criticisms of Sufis, but were themselves practicing Sufis.
Right.
So it was kind of like an internal critique. For him, he wasn't really in the worldview of Sufism. He was kind of like outside of it, kind of looking at it from, without, although his poetry is quite mystical too sometimes.
Thank you.
I hope that answered it. Sorry, it requires a
Yeah,
lot of different. Iqbal is just complicated,
This was very, very learned answer. I will start with someone. Please.
Okay. I thought it was very interesting when you said legal is everything that is bad at one point, and then you also have the distinction of accidental and essential.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is there a place or where is the place for ill will or evil will? Because if evil is everything that is bad,
yeah,
fruit can be bad, but you wouldn't say the fruit is evil.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
the moral aspect of how is that?
That's a very good question. A colleague of mine, in the same volume in which this dialogue appeared, Rosabel Ansari, she's a scholar of Farabi. She wrote a piece in there. It's on climate change in Avicenna, using Avicenna to address the problem of climate change today. Is it an essential evil or an accidental evil from an Avicenna worldview picture? And it's very clear that Avicenna's language doesn't really graft on so well to contemporary discussions without a lot of footnotes and discussion, right? And you need an an expert who also is interested in contemporary ideas to relate this. But I think if we look at it from a different angle of vision, it'll make more sense. Because really, when we talk about the reality, the metaphysical reality of evil, that's one thing. And when we deal with moral deficiency, that's another thing. And it's beautiful because in Arabic, there are all these distinctions that are already there, right? They're embedded in the language. So the word for evil is shar, right? And it comes from a word. See, one of the secrets of the Arabic language, I'm not making this up. This is like standard in the, words often when they're, especially when they're onomatopoeic, there's something about them that tells you about the reality of that thing. So whenever words are with the sh sound in Arabic, it has to do with kind of manifestation. So if you look at the word tree, shajara goes out, right? Shi'a, like the rays of the light of the sun. And then shar, something that's, going away from what is good, evil. That's what we would call like metaphysical evil, right? The absence of good or the presence of, the privation of good, however you want to call it. But then there's another thing which is a kind of like moral ugliness, which we kind of refer to as evil. And the Arabic word for that is qubh, which literally means ugliness. And people, especially scholars, when they're not careful, they translate that as evil too. So you'll be reading like a theological text, they're dealing with like human moral ailments, and they're calling that evil. But the Arabic word is not shar. The Arabic word there, it's ugliness. And the opposite of that is husn, is beauty. So it's really interesting because when we think of Islamic ethics, and this has to kind of, it's a chapter now that's being rewritten, right? Especially from the time of George Hirani's famous book on Islamic ethics, which use largely analytic and British categories to try to understand Islamic ethics. Now it's being challenged significantly, but that ethical worldview it's not divided along the lines of beauty and ugliness. It's divided along the lines of goodness and badness, but they're not metaphysical problems when you deal with them when they devolve back to the human being. So where does that problem come in? That comes in with respect to human freedom. I remember at one point, I think in the dialogue, there was a reference to human freedom. So human freedom, a human being can and does act in accordance with their nature, but also against their nature. So when they're acting against their nature, when they should be doing something that's beautiful and they don't, then it's ugly. Right? That's one way to look at it, is to say that that's the absence of the presence of what's beautiful. So I like when I live with my children, for example, I don't raise them thinking about good and evil. That's not my moral universe. That's maybe a Christian moral universe. I don't know. I grew up in Christian schools and I thought of good and evil, and I read Islamic books that were influenced by Christian, categories. So I said good and evil, read the Quran, good and evil. But then now I realized, wait a second, it's not about good and evil. It's about beauty and about ugliness. So if my daughter does something that's not beautiful, I wouldn't say that's evil or that's bad. I'd say that's not beautiful. And she said, "Yeah, I know. I'm doing something that's a little bit ugly." It changes it completely, right? So I think if you make that distinction between the human moral categories and then like the actual presence of metaphysical categories like evil and the lack of goodness in the world, it'll kind of put those two in the sharper relief from one another.
Right, I'll shower you with questions, but so that's why I'm looking for questions. I don't want to take someone else's spot. At some point, I'll need to press you further about the ugly and beautiful and how this is really understanding. But meanwhile, there's another thing I wanted to ask you about. I'm still not understanding exactly in which sense your point about God being everywhere, but being less somewhere than in other places. Yeah. Of course, I think we all thought about Plotinus because it's the easy way of thinking about it. So this would be one possibility. Another possibility would be to think that this dunya has matter, which is bad or ugly.
Yes.
That's why there is less of God's presence.
Yeah.
So these were my first two alternatives. And of course, must mean that God's presence is not occupational. So I need some further explanation here. I'm not sure I'm using the right categories.
Yeah. No. Yeah. You hit it. You nailed it when you said matter. So obviously God's immaterial, right? And at the same time, so from these authors, the way they think about God is they tend to identify the word for existence is wujud. They identify that with God. And the word wujud, again, I hate continuously taking you back to Arabic etymologies, but it's very important because it tells you so much about the way they look at things, right? Like the linguistic structure of the way they look at the world. The word wujud has to do with something that's found, And so there's this ternary wajd, wujud, wujdan, right? It's being, consciousness, and belief, just like the Satchit Ananda in Hinduism. So here you have God as finding, right? We translate it as being. That's one way to translate it, but it refers to a kind of finding, the highest level where the sage's knowledge meets with the divine self finding. At that level, God is to be found everywhere, right? So that's why in that dialogue the sage says, there isn't a place where God is not, right? From one perspective, but because there are variations in this in the ontological hierarchy, kind of like the presence of light, right? Light is more luminous up there, but less luminous down here. To the degree that there is a less of a light, so to speak, or less of a presence and more of a matter, that sage in that dialogue speaks of God not being there. Technically, God's always there, of course, right? So another way to flip it is to say, is God found there? So go back to the language of presence or existence. It should ideally take us back to the language of finding. Is God found there? Yes, he's found there. Okay, what about at a higher level? Is God to be found there? To be found there at a higher level. How about higher than that? To be found, let's say, outside of the sublunar realm. To be found there in a much greater level. So the question of presence, if it takes us to the understanding of God's own finding, self-finding, and the degree to which we participate in that finding, then that's kind of the sense in which they spoke about God not being in a particular place. None of these authors would say that God is never anywhere else, right? He's always where he's supposed to be. Right? It just has to do with the question of the level of intensity of matter and the interaction between them as well. So now the other part of your question, which had to do with the morality, that we need to kind of like that's another
that's a different question. I was just anticipating there.
That's a bigger, huge problem.
Sorry,
he has a book actually on some of that in Ghazali.
Yeah, and in your volume.
Oh, in that article, there's an article.
But and I'm very absorbed with these questions as well. I'm studying with Muhammad. He threw me into this complexity, and I've never been able to get out. Like Wujud, it's inescapable. But yeah.
I'm sorry, could you give the example one more time about the word Wujud?
Yeah. So you want me to put it on the board for you? Will that help you if I do that?
It's okay. I missed the basic explanation.
Do you know Arabic?
Yes. I'm from Afghanistan.
Let me do it on the board because it'll make, I think seeing it will make a whole lot more sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the word wujud in Arabic, it looks like this. Right? Wujud. Now, from this, you have many different words, right? The fundamental meaning of this word, wajada, is to find. Right? To find. But it also is the basis for many other words, like the word wajd, which is ecstasy, for example, and then wijdan, which is consciousness or awareness. All of it comes from that same root. So the Arabic term for what we would call existence or being, it has implied within it the notion of finding awareness, a kind of self-awareness and an awareness that kind of also is not self-reflexive, and then a kind of bliss that comes from the union of those two. So one example that I tend to give to my students is, let's say if you lose your keys, let's say you've lost your keys. So you now need to go look for them. So you start finding them. And then when you find them, you see them and they're there. So they exist there. And what do? You grab them. So you found them, now you hold them. And of course, you're aware of them, and then when you get them, you're not indifferent, especially if it's like, you needed to get your keys to get somewhere. You go, and you get happy. And that bliss that comes out of the finding of the object that was lost is exactly what is implied by that term wujud, right? So some translators today, it doesn't always work, and it sometimes obscures the point. They translate even Islamic philosophical texts where the word is wujud, they'll translate it as finding/being. And it works depending on the author. But if you're doing Avicenna, for example, that's not going to work very well. It'll mess things up pretty badly. But anyway, that's just the reason that's important is because amongst Islamic philosophers like Mullah Sadr and others, they link that to the question of what is called shu'ur, or awareness. The word shu'ur comes from a word that has to do with poetry and hair. Right, remember I told you, because it's extending out the and poetry, of course, because it's manifold, right, and has many different layers. So that presence links up with wujud in authors like Mullah Sadr, and then also is related to love and to mercy. That's why my book, The Triumphs of Mercy, has to do with how God is everywhere, and that's why mercy is everywhere and compassion is everywhere. But depending on the degrees of intensity, right? Because in some cases, a person goes and kills a person, there's not a whole lot of mercy there, right? But nevertheless, it exists, but just on a much subtler level. And you got to find the rest of the mercy out there. So it ties into ethics and these kinds of things. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Thanks, Amber. It's very fun. So I was just thinking, like, one reason I might not listen to somebody is that they constantly talk, and like they don't take a break.
Yeah. Yes.
And I mean, part of the idea would be that the way a speech works, it requires silences between sentences, between words, and so on. And kind of relating it to the God issue, if everything is a way of God's speech and everything is an element of God's speech, one issue might be that, are we just stretching now the analogy of the speech or the metaphor of the speech too much that it's just hard to make sense of it? And relatedly, I think when sometimes at least people talk about the issue of God's silence, one issue is that, why isn't God talking to me? Why is like God is everywhere, maybe, but it's not like directed speech.
That's right.
Yeah. While he might have had directed a speech to like the prophet and so on.
That's right. Yeah, that's a great question. And also with that is why if there is going to be directed speech, where's the eye contact too? I want yes, look at me too. I have to be looking at. So I mean, there's an internal critique amongst Muslim philosophers themselves. Not all of them accept the idea that God's speech at every ontological level entails, for example, that we're all words, right? Sohrawardi, some scholars have tried to argue that Sohrawardi has a position like that, but if they read his Persian writings, and they don't, it's in there very clearly that he identifies human beings with reverberations of a primordial echo, right? That one's easy. In Avaza Parajibrel, he does this. But in others, even in Razi, for example, he's not going to necessarily enjoy a worldview that looks something like this, because especially if it's going to blur the distinction between God and humans. And certain Ismaili authors take an opposite approach, right? For them, it's they can relate to the question of words, but then they may wish to extend it to other things. And when it gets to revelation, there's some debate about what's precisely at issue here. Cyrus Zargar has a nice article he just published, which looks at this exact question. How is it that human beings are the recipients of this divine speech, but only particular classes of human beings, what we call prophets? And in it, he's also undercutting Sarusha's, views, as you know, who has who's influenced by certain Ismaili, I think, theories and a little bit of Avicenna too. The easy way around all of it, as far as I could see, keeping in mind that there's some degree of difference amongst some of these authors, and maybe even Nasruddin Tusi too. He might have a different view. The more peripatetic thinkers are not necessarily comfortable with a view like this always. Is that if we don't want to look at them as speech, because that's maybe it's a semantic thing. I think Tusi might say this to Honowi in their letters, if I'm not mistaken. One thing that they'll agree on is that it's signs, right? And signs are a form of speech too. I remember many years ago here at the University of Toronto, I took this course on semiotics. And it was like a bird course. Everyone used to take it because it was like you get like a 90 if you took it. But I genuinely was interested in it. The professor was like not allowed to like teach it after a while. It was one of those bird courses. But it was incredible because we talked about language as signs, we talked about signs as signs, modes as signs, but we never looked at the human being as a sign. Right. And the fundamental to the Islamic worldview from the Quran and any of these authors we can look at, including Al-Kindi, people like this, is that those signs are everywhere and they communicate everything that we need to know about what's going on, right? What's a sign? وَفِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ آيَةٍ, the poet says, وَفِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ آيَةٍ تَدُلُّ عَلَى أَنَّهُ وَاحِدٌ, right? In everything there's a sign pointing to the fact that he is one, right? So سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ, the verse says, right? Those signs will be shown. It'll be shown everywhere. It'll be shown out there and also within yourself until you know that it is the real. So the word sign is interesting because the Quran and the tradition that reflects upon it says that those signs are outside and that they're within you. And it's the same word that's used for what we would call verses in the Quran. I don't like the word verses in the Quran because the Arabs didn't have a tradition of theater where you walk down verso, right? So even our basic terminology has to basically change. They're not verses. The Quran presents itself as containing signs, not verses, about 6,256 signs. So now those signs are in a book, they're inside of you, and they're outside there. Now, what more does one need for speech than that, right? The communication's happening at all times. Now, why some get a direct, kind of address than others? The most satisfying answer I found really is in Avicenna, in his proof of prophecy. I really thought that was really interesting, how he looks at a specific kind of human configuration that is situated perfectly to receive that divine speech. But that's another discussion in the whole tradition, right? They go. Ibn Arabi has a very vast way of looking at things, and the reason why I said there's eye contact, it wasn't a joke because he has this whole thing about how our existence, it's really God's face turned towards us. Right? That's why not everybody sees everything that God has to offer, because God's looking at everybody in accordance with their own specificity, what they're all about. That's the face you're going to get. I think about it I have 3 children, right? And they all know me as Baba universally, but I'm very different with each of them, like absolutely, because their natures are so different. The answer that's going to work for my son will never work for one of my daughters, right? And whereas with one of them, if they have a question, I say something, it's so satisfying. I tell my son, he's like, "Come on, that's nonsense. What are you talking about?" Right? I need proof. So it's kind of like that with the divine. And so what Ibn Arabi says, and Ayn Quzad does too in that book, he says this is really it's a face-to-face encounter with the divine throughout your life. And so there's this conversation that's always happening, metaphysically, ontologically, reading and not reading the science.
Thank you. That's all extremely interesting to me. Can I tell a joke?
Absolutely. This is a philosophy department. Surely this is exactly where jokes are most welcome.
Yeah. So I mean that people don't know how to detect God in the world is of course also present in the Christian tradition. So I'll tell you a story that I learned in Holland, which is my country of origin, and the story is very Dutch. I think it may exist beyond Holland, but anyway, the story is there's a big flood, which is, something we traditionally dealt with. And there's a man who is sitting on top of his house because the water's gotten so high up. And, it's rising and rising. And somebody comes by in a rowboat and says, oh, come on, come on. You're going to be drowned if you stay up. This. No, 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 no. God will help me. Some of you already see where this is going. And then a larger boat comes by and says, come on. We want to save you. He says, no, no, no. God will save me. And then a helicopter comes by and says, come on. We want to save you. He says, no, no, no. God will save me. So he drowns.
Yeah.
And he comes to heaven. And he says, why'd you let me drown? God says, I sent you a rowboat.
Yes. I know that. That's a wonder, exactly, right? So the communication is always happening, exactly.
Yeah, and you go to Canada. So anyway, but that was the joke, and I couldn't resist it because it's one of my favorites. But my question was, one of my questions was about your discussion of the term plotting. And I was very interested because I was just reading Leibniz this morning, who talks about how God plans the world, and he thinks about all the individuals who want to be in there, and he wants them to all harmonize with each other. And somebody could call that plotting, but as your story indicated, plotting may have a negative connotation. So Leibniz never uses any kind of translation of plotting. So I was very curious about the Arabic world. Sure. Because I was wondering whether if you translate it as planning, whether you do an injustice to the word, whether it leaves out something that's there in the
that's lovely.
Arabic.
That's a great question. So the word that would come closer to what Leibniz meant, it's the word tadbir in Arabic, tadbir, which can be used for like Tusi uses it, for example, with when he speaks about arranging for household. Right, there's the tadbir of the house, taking care of the laundry and the dishes and all that kind of stuff. It can also refer to like governance, like just governance, right? Running a society, how to arrange people, where to put the police, where to put the criminal, all that kind of stuff. But that's different from the word scheming or plotting, because that word can have a very negative connotation. Right? If you're scheming, then you're presumably doing it, with some idea of deceit, right? And that's how it's used in the Quran with respect to human beings, right? They scheme and God schemes, and God is the best of schemers, right? Or plotters. So scheming can have a very negative connotation, depends. When it goes back to God, though, it always has something very beautiful about it, right? It's always something that has to do with a kind of arrangement that's really for your betterment, even if you don't necessarily see it that way. So Arabic, it has one of these unique features. I'm sure it exists in other languages. I just don't know. But because it's based largely on a trilateral root system, if you have a certain root that comes with a semantic field that tells you everything that you need to know about what that word is all about. But if you flip the roots around, it takes you to other words that have associated meaning. So I'll give one example. It's a little abstract, and I promise it'll make sense. The word for knowledge it's ALM with a little funny thing at the beginning, ilm. And that's the word for knowledge. But if you flip around two of the letters, you get the word amal, which has to do with action. So the two of them are related, right? The word for grave is qabr, QBR. And if you flip them around, you also from that you get the word also qurb, which QRB, which has to do with proximity. So the grave is near. The word sabr, SBR, is patience. You flip them around, basar, it has to do with vision. Person who's patient is going to be somebody who's going to have they'll see the long picture of it, right? The word makar for this word for scheming is MKR, which has to do with scheming, plotting. We flipped some of the letters around, KRM, which has to do with generosity. So often the authors will say things like, God's his plotting for us, right? It's always with our best interest in mind, even if we think it's not good. There is another part of the makr that the authors and the tradition gets into, and that is Quranic as well, in which God does in bad dudes. He does bad dudes in with that same plotting. They think they can plot, well, you know what? I have a lot more of it too, and watch what I do. So there is a bit of that too. But generally speaking, it's to be distinguished with with governance of the world, right? Which has a much more broader kind of connotation. Here, it's God, directly involved in human affairs, arranging things and dealing with people on their own level.
Does it have a connotation also of being particularly clever? Because scheming sounds
It can, yeah, it can for sure. And in many Islamic languages, like in Urdu, for example, makar. Are you Urdu speaking? And maybe in Persian too, it has that, right? Makar is somebody who's clever. Actually, what's really funny is the word Aflatun, Plato. In Urdu, it means also like a clever, like a can mean a scoundrel too. Actually, this guy's an Aflatun. It can mean
foxes. Foxes are makar.
Yeah. Foxes are makar. Exactly. Foxes are makar.
Right. Yeah, there's
exactly.
Clever
because they're
yeah.
Clever. So cleverness is never a positive thing, right? And Rumi has, because we quoted Rumi a few times, my favorite verse, and I actually have it on my door in my office to remind me. He says, Ziraki befrusho hayrani bekhar, Ziraki zan nasto hayrani nazar. Sell away cleverness and purchase bewilderment instead. Because cleverness is just conjecture, and bewilderment is true vision.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, Rumi says it. Rumi says it. Actually, I taught a course on Rumi in the philosophy department at my school, which is never. They don't even teach me philosophy at my school. Right now, there's a course on Rumi.
I know that's
yeah, and it was a fun course. There was a yes, sir. You had a question?
I think there was a person online who was been waiting for long.
Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Whoever's next.
Thank you very much. The reference to cleverness just now reminds me, in the Middle English of the contemplative author of The Cloud of Unknowing, the way you spelled the word concept was conceit. And the partial intellect references, if I might also offer a joke, reminds me of Mullah Nasruddin under the lamppost at night, on his hands and knees looking for his key, and he's asked, "Is this where you dropped it?" So, "Oh no, I dropped it by the door of my house, but the light is better here." So my question comes from early on. You used the word theoretical, and I very much like the talk and the readings of yours I've had a chance to glance at. You used the word theoretical, and it reminded me of how in Greek and Plato, theoria was an action of going to view a spiritual event.
Yeah.
It came to be applied to mean meditation. And so my question is very broad, but I'm also reminded Socrates had a guiding, sort of a guardian angel. He had a divine voice which gave him advice sometimes, and how much of his practice was questioning things. And myself, as a longtime contemplative, how much not knowing too much is a very wholesome practice.
Yeah.
The broad question, and please take it anywhere you like, is the relationship with the phrase philosophy of religion. In Islam, how is philosophy being conceptualized in relationship to how religion is conceptualized? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a very good question. It reminds me, when you mentioned the thing about theoria and in the ancient Greeks, it reminds me of some of Peter Kingsley's earlier work. Peter Kingsley was, I think, the first author whom I read who really drew my attention to that, the practical dimension of theoria, and I think it was Ancient Philosophy, Mystery and Magic, one of his first books. So thanks. That took me back to a really nice time. The way Islamic philosophy has been presented, like historically, so that is to say, in terms of its historiography in the last 200 years in the West, is that the philosophers are somehow antithetical to religion. So you have the religious doctors on the one side, then you have these crazy philosophers on the other side, and that wasn't really helped so much by the fact that you have a lot of Straussians, for example, historically, who've written about Farabi like this and some other later Islamic philosophers. But when I started kind of looking into this question, when I was doing my doctorate here at the University of Toronto, it was specifically in relation to this question: what's the relationship between philosophy and religion in an Islamic worldview, especially because I had thought to myself, if it's not, if they're not concerned with the sources of the religion, then why do we call them Islamic philosophers? And does that explain why some people call them Arabic philosophers, even though most of them weren't Arabs? Is because they were writing in Arabic and they were somehow kind of secular? Is that what's going on? So I started digging deep, and I had a wonderful teacher of Islamic philosophy who was my own teacher and Deborah Black's teacher, Michael Marmora, who passed away in 2009, very well-known professor here. And I remember speaking to him about this very early on, and he said to me, dig deep. Look at what the philosophers have said about the Quran, and he gave me a couple of good leads. And I noticed that every single Islamic philosopher that we can think of, they were concerned with the sources of the religion on one level or another. Sure, they may have had different interpretations from the majority authors, but that's par for the course when you get into Sufi writings too, right? Ibn Arabi has radically different views of the majority of people. The majority are never a standard for anything. Same with Rumi. And then I started thinking that, what about some of these other authors who are known to be heretical, right? So I'm thinking of Abu Bakr al-Razi, and I remember I brought this up with Peter Adamson many years ago. And this was before his book on Razi came out, which I think it came out earlier this year. And he said to me, oh, you should check out his medical writings. His medical writings, he's quoting the Quran with reverence. And I thought, that's weird. I always knew him to be like a bona fide atheist or something like that, and he was a vegan too. Like he had like these really different practices. He was against eating meat and he didn't believe in God. And there it is. He's quoting the Quran with reverence. So then I started noticing patterns amongst the philosophers themselves, which is that they're deeply concerned with the same things that the rest of the Muslim authors are concerned with. They're concerned with religion ultimately, on one very fundamental level, but also from a very scriptural perspective. They're concerned with the practice and of what comes out of an Islamic worldview. So this led to a certain kind of problematization, in my mind at least, to start digging deeper. And I have to admit, even after 20 years, there aren't too many really very good sources in contemporary scholarship that show the relationship between religion and philosophy in Islam. And I think the reason is because that distinction, it's kind of like the way we go about operating, dividing things up. But that's not kind of the world that they lived in, right? Even if you were to ask Avicenna, as he wrote those first Quran commentaries of his, what are you doing? Are you being religious, or are you being a philosopher, right? Despite the fact that maybe someone like Dimitri Gutas would disagree, Avicenna would say, as he does in his writings, he'd say, I'm talking about the ta'akkadul wujud, right? The assuredness of existence and everything that comes out of that worldview. One dimension of which is commenting upon the Quran, another dimension of which is ithbat an-nubuwwah. He has a whole proof of prophecy. So there's a lecture I gave some years ago for a colleague, one of Deborah's colleagues actually, and it was on specifically the relationship between philosophy and religion in Islamic civilization. And the thing that I tried to argue there, looking at not just Arabic and Persian authors, but also Chinese authors in the tradition, and authors who wrote in Sanskrit and some who wrote in English, is that what tends to connect all of them is that they all believe in the religion of Islam, right? So I thought the word Muslim philosopher would make total sense because they're living in that worldview, they're using the languages, they're engaging with one another, they're explicitly commenting on prayer, for example, and the practice of prayer. And whenever they deal with questions of evil or ugliness, it always has to do with the Sharia and the practices that come from that. So the standards of beauty and ugliness are determined by the sacred law itself. So I think it comes more from our own kind of dichotomies between things like religion and philosophy, or even theology and philosophy, for that matter. That's why I think studying the Sufi philosophers, it's the most interesting, because here you have individuals who, writing from the very beginning of from Avicenna at least onward, who are practicing mystics, Quran commentators. They pass for what we know to be philosophers because they studied logic and that kind of stuff. And they're also theologians because they're fundamentally concerned with God and divine love and that kind of stuff. And they're all together in this one person. What are we going to do with that? There's no term that they would use other than, like Ibn Arabi would say, what I'm concerned with is tahqiq. That's the word they would use, which is verification. or realization. I'm here to demonstrate for you the haqq or the truth of things as I've lived it in myself, and as I'm gonna, give you some samples in books. But that reminds me of one Persian poem. I have to share one with you because it says it so well. This goes back to Mahmud Shibistari, this great Persian sage, speaking about the self-evidentiary nature of reality, but how we kind of tend to obscure with these categories, which is a natural human tendency. He says, Zahinadan ke khurshid taban be nur sham juya dar biyaban. He says, how many fools are there who go about with a candle in their hand in broad daylight looking for the sun? I hope that satisfies your question.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Yeah, I like your talk. And I think in your talk, you mentioned two kinds of maybe being of people. I may miss that. One is from evil to God, another from God to evil. It reminds me like about the Buddhist figure of Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva can get elected, but still choose to remain this world, help others.
Yeah, the bodhisattvas.
So I'm not sure, are you talking the similar thing or have some more implication about this two approach?
Yeah, that. I mean, some people have written about the relationship between the bodhisattva ideals and some of these sages who kind of, come back, right?
Yeah.
The model that they based themselves off of is the practice of the Prophet of Islam, because he went into the cave, received the revelation, and comes back, right? Comes back to society, spends time, teaching people. It wasn't very comfortable for him doing that, right? He was called a liar, and people, threw things at him, and for a good 13 years he was opposed by his own people. So another part of it is that I think that often when we think about the function of a teacher, of what a teacher is supposed to do, right? If they're not living it in themselves, right, and then how are they supposed to communicate that to people? Right. And so for many of them, it's like, even if they want to just disappear into nothingness and just, save themselves, well, you have a function of knowledge. You have to go teach. You have to teach regardless of your circumstance. I'll give you one beautiful example, because it's from the practice of a contemporary living Islamic philosopher, somebody whom I've known for a long time, mentor and teacher, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, the most famous Islamic philosopher alive today. He's 90 years old now. He celebrated his 90th birthday earlier this year. Some of you may know him because he's in the Library of Living Philosophers volume, and he has written, I don't know, his bibliography is a 300-page book, so it's a lot. He's written a lot, but he's a living philosopher, trained in Iran and obviously at Harvard. He got his PhD from Harvard when he was 25 years old, so he's a really smart guy too. But it's his intelligence is one thing, but being around him, you see how he lives this material. So at some point, probably in his early 80s, I think, he'd broken his hip, and it was a terrible, it was really painful, and he'd been in the hospital. But he at that time was teaching a course in Islamic philosophy at the university. He still teaches, even till today. He teaches like a course or two. And the doctor said to him, "Oh, you should stay here for like a month. Take all this medication. Maybe you can go home like after like 6 weeks or something like that." And after the first day of the surgery and he was recovering, he said, "I have to teach my class." So he had one of his colleagues pick him up, and he went to class on a walker to go teach Islamic philosophy. And someone said to him, "Well, what are you doing? Why are you don't have to do any of this, And he said, "No, I have to teach. I have to teach." Right? That kind of dedication, that's incredible. And that's a lived example. So if philosophy can be lived in the body and communicated to people, to students, it has a very different effect upon them.
Frightened by the expectations.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No more calling in sick. Yes.
No one else. I think I'm going to the lunch. So no. Okay. I wanted to ask. So Simone Weil, I don't know how to say her last name. Weil. I just say Weil because that sounds French-ish. Simone Weil. She talks about affliction. My understanding of the concept is that she kind of thinks one of the things that God afflicts you with is actually like not being able to understand his wisdom. And that's like, it's not your fault. It's just like God has afflicted you with this, and all you can do is, I think she says, like, throw yourself at the feet of the cross, or something, and maybe God will eventually help you understand.
Yeah, it's a concept of waiting on God.
Yeah, waiting on God. Yeah. And so I'm just wondering, because a little bit of your talk, it made me think that maybe there's this idea that, okay, suffering in general isn't a person's fault necessarily, but not listening is something fully in their control. Like, they should develop themselves so that they can listen and become ready to listen. And I'm wondering, is there any sense where God will afflict people with being unable to listen, or is that only as a punishment? Because there's obviously that idea in the Quran that people are punished by their ears being closed. And so I just wanted to.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So unlike the first one, which was like 7 or 8 parts, right? It's a wide-ranging question, but for the, the long and the short of it, I guess that's the best way to put it, is that anything that a human being goes through, these authors tell us that there's always something you can learn, right? And the principle, which I heard from one of my teachers many years ago, but it's you'll see it in Ibn Arabi in different versions and others. It's that not everything that happens is good, but there is good in everything that happens. So there are genuinely bad things that happen to people in the world. Somebody comes, punches you in the face, and steals your car keys and runs away with your car. You can't say, oh, well, that's wondrous. It's just phenomenal. I mean, there might be a place a person can be at, but you gotta chase the guy down and do what you can to apprehend him, right? Obviously, right? There might be some lessons that are to be learned from that. The most obvious of which are, next time, keep your car keys closer, right? And there are obvious little things, but on a much grander scale, right? Often we don't see because we don't know the full curve of our own lives, let alone everyone else's lives. We don't know where something might be terrible for us right now, but maybe later on might be good. And I go back to the example of my children, because often I see things way before they do, because I'm more experienced in the world. So something won't go one of their ways, and then they're 6 years old, for example, and they're looking at, this is the most worst thing that's ever happened. And I think to myself, actually, it's not that bad. Just wait and see. Rumi gives the best example of a mother who takes her child for a haircut. Right? Anyone's ever tried to take their child for a haircut, it can get pretty bad. And so it must have been the case in his day and age too, because this kid's kicking and screaming, and the mother's standing there laughing and smiling. And then he explains, he says, because she knows the end. The end is this beautiful kid who doesn't have, the hair's not all over the place. It looks kept and everything. But for the child, it's just annoying. And he may not even care, even after the haircut's over. He might be like, that was still a really ugly experience. Why did I have to go through that? So he may not necessarily even ever come to acknowledge it, right? So, and that's another dimension of the teachings, right? That you may not necessarily acknowledge everything that happens to you as being good, because you might not ever be able to get out of, most experiences finding something good in them. Sometimes there are horrible things that happen which you can't ever square, right? For a personal benefit. But even then, you'll find people. One of the great things about YouTube is there's all these interviews with all kinds of individuals, celebrities, people who've lived through war, and people who've been on death row and have been exonerated, and just all kinds of really cool things that I do when I'm driving between cities. I just listen to all these, and sometimes these people say things like, actually, like I kind of get it, now this, at the end of my life, I kind of see where things, why they had to go this way. And no one ever really knows what they're going through, according to these authors, other than that person themselves, because they know themselves the best, and they know their own tendencies the best, and what they kind of need. Each person needs certain things, right? So that's one way they address it, but it's a very complicated problem. And I would never, presume to ever be able to present a comprehensive answer for all of the cases. But generally speaking, there's they call it an ibara. It's a lesson to be learned, right? Ibara comes from a word that has to do with crossing over, right? So you're here right now. If you go there, you'll then be at a different vantage point. And perhaps when one goes there, they might learn something different and know something different, and maybe even be something.
Thank you.
But it's led us to this maze of free will and God's enabling us to learn the lesson or not, etc., etc. Anyone whom I forgot? No, great. Then I think we should stop here because otherwise we'll start a new further discussion. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
It's so nice because we started in September with a talk on suffering, and we are closing with the meaning of suffering. so that's perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Ibrahim, I see Ibrahim over there. I just want to say hello to him. Thank you very much for coming. Nice to see you, Deborah. Ibrahim, how are you doing?
See you. Thanks, Mohammed.
Nice to see you.
You still have to know whether it's good that you were.
Right, exactly. Take care. All right, thank you guys very much for coming.
Thank you. I did sign up. Yes, you're coming from
Very good.
Yes, right?
Yes, yes.
Good.
Yeah. It's in the garden. I think I signed you up as you got them.
No, I haven't changed this.